Celius College, and that college is an academic platform providing a kind of link between the humanities, the culture of science, and the humanities at Heidelberg University. It's indeed a universal platform, and Thomas Fuchs is coordinating a project there that has something to do with the cultural faculties of human beings and the link to their body. And I told you about this so that you understand that Thomas Fuchs has always been an interdisciplinary researcher. And when you check his CV, you would notice he's always been very much focused on interdisciplinarity. He studied medicine, got his medical doctor, studied philosophy, and got his PhD. And then at the University Clinic in Heidelberg, he's not only working at the Center for Psychosocial Medicine, he works as a clinician there. He's at the same time also a professor for the philosophical foundations of psychiatry and psychology at Heidelberg University. And that means he's a Karl Jaspers professor. Karl Jaspers is one of the leading philosophers influencing psychiatrists, and he also was one of those researchers laying the foundation to create a link between philosophy and psychiatry. Thomas Fuchs continues this tradition, and I brought some of his recent publications. There is a well-known book called The Brain, a Relational Organ, or the English title was Ecology of the Brain. So somewhat different from the German title. His recent book is In Defense of Human Beings. You have to read that. And I can just tell the international community that this book is translated already and is going to be published in English soon. Mr. Fuchs, it's a pleasure to have you here, and it's a pleasure for you to contribute to our interpersonal and bodily space. Dear Mr. Sommer, thank you very much for this introduction. Thanks for introducing me. Thanks for inviting me too. Dear pupils, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to speak to you today. In particular, because for over a year now, I haven't talked to real people. So it's a pleasure to talk to real people instead of having to talk into your laptop. So it's such a happy coincidence, and I'm really happy to see some real people. It is wonderful to experience once again the bodily presence, the physical presence of people. We missed that very much. And I think we are going soon to be able to enjoy that generally. Now I'm going to talk about the bodily and interpersonal space. The philosopher Helmut Plessner coined a distinction once, and Mr. Sommer has already mentioned that yesterday in his presentation. He made a distinction between being a body and having a body. A human being is always at the same time a body, a subject body, and he has this subject body that he is as a physical body. What does that mean? Well, in the German language, we have the possibility of using the two different words to designate two different attitudes and positions. There's one position where we naturally and without paying attention to it, we live, perceive, behave in and through our body, which we call Leib in German. And there is this other position where we focus on this Leib, this subject body, as a physical body, as a physical object. We deal with it consciously, we train it, we exercise it, we model its appearance through clothing, hairstyle, makeup, or finally, we have it medically treated. The etymology also fits in with this. The concept of the Leib. Leib is a German word that goes back to the Middle High German word of Lib, which meant at the same time body and life. The Leib, the subject body, the lived body, is therefore everything that's alive, lived and felt. The word Körper, body, is derived from the Latin word corpus, which means body or corpse, as in English, a corpse. And it denotes primarily the material object of anatomy and physiology. In other languages, this distinction between the two terms does not exist. Instead of Leib, one says in English, for instance, lived body or subject body, or the body that I am. And in French, you would use the words corps vécu or corps sujet. Well, which attitude, which position is more important in each case, the bodily or the general one changes from day to day, from situation to situation. Sometimes you don't even think about your subject body, you just live through it. And sometimes you focus on your physical body and you have a more corporeal attitude. It all depends on a historical and cultural development, the either physical or spiritual attitude. And here we have seen a historical change, and one can see that because the word Leib in German is no longer present in today's modern German language, everyday language. We just use Leib in a religious or philosophical context, the body of Christ, the astral body, the body-soul problem. This is where we use the term Leib. But most of the time, we just talk about the body. This was very much different until the last century in the German language. In one of the first German dictionaries, written by Samuel Stosch, 1780, it says that the word Leib is only used for living things and Körper is used for lifeless, physical things. One says the Leib, the subject body of the man, but the body of the son. Only in anatomy you would call the corpse of a human being a body. Otherwise, the body of a human is a term that you only use in a joking way. Well, times and attitudes have obviously changed. In the last 200 years, the body as an object, as a visible, tangible object, as an instrument even now we can handle and which we can also manipulate, has obviously come to the fore when we compare it to the subject body, the lived and felt body. The fact that we still speak of Unterleib, which means lower body or abdomen in English, or the upper body, torso, is an interesting indication that the body rather belongs to a deeper pre- or unconscious sphere of life, where the physical body is closer to the conscious self, namely the torso, which is upper body, if you translate literally from German. It is precisely my subject body that I am, and it is my body that I have and specifically use. So no wonder today we speak just of Körper, of physical body. It's the instrumentalized, mechanized body that can be repaired by medicine, and we live with it today. If phenomenology still speaks time and again of Leib, the lived body, the subject body, phenomenology does it because it wants to bring the original experience of being a body once again to the agenda. I'm now going to first examine the relationship between lived body or subject body and physical body in everyday experience. And then I'm going to talk about the development in early childhood, and I will trace how this distinction actually comes about. How can being a body become having a body? And we will see that has something to do with the development of intersubjectivity. As late as in the first years of a child's life, the interpersonal space emerges for the child. It learns to step out of its bodily center, as it were, and to see its body as one body amongst many other bodies. It is this ability that the philosopher Helmut Plessner called the eccentrical position of the human being. We live primarily out of our bodily center, but we can also step out of this center anytime and see ourselves from the outside. And that is to say, we can see ourselves with the eyes of others. But as we will see, this is precisely what produces our common intersubjective world, our life world. It is important to understand this development. Let's start once again with this relationship. I said already that our everyday experience is characterized by a polarity. At one pole of this movement between being a body and having a body, we find the subject body, the lived body, as the carrier of our life, as a medium that mediates all our perceptions and movements. But this lived body remains silent, as if in the background. That is to say, we are not aware of our eyes when we see. We do not care about our ears when we hear. When we speak, we do not have to control our tongue separately. And our legs carry us to our destination without us paying attention to our legs. The lived body or subject body is just implicitly present in all these forms of lives and acts of life. It is the basis of the self-evidence of the execution of life. When the subject body emerges from this latency, it becomes the experienced and felt body. And it is the subject body first of the place of general feeling of comfort or discomfort, vitality, freshness, tiredness, tension, relaxation, hunger and thirst, and other bodily sensations. And finally, the subject body is a kind of resonance chamber for all our moods and feelings that we experience. Fear makes the body feel narrow and tremulous. Joy makes the body wide and lifts us up. Anger makes us tremble or clench our fists. Sadness and pain are depressing or dissolve into tears. In all of this, the corporeality is something that happens to us, that just happens spontaneously, that we feel in ourselves and that we are affected by. The body presents itself as an affectable or pathic body. At the same time, these are experiences in which nature takes its course. Nature here means the impulses of hunger, thirst, tiredness, tension, excitement. This usually occurs spontaneously and unsolicitedly. And not infrequently, it occurs in a disturbing and disconcerting way. That is to say, it has a life of its own, an emergence of its own. The more we step out of the immediacy of the body and use it specifically to perform or learn certain things or movements, the more this subject body loses its mediating qualities. It becomes an instrument that I control and use in a targeted way. But I can also expect that sometimes my body denies service and it gets into my way, so to speak. So the subject body becomes a physical body when the usual course of life gets disturbed. For instance, if you are clumsy and fall, or if you have a state of exhaustion or heaviness or tiredness, or in the case of injury or illness. If you go for a walk with a sore leg, it's no longer naturally receding to the background. It stands out, and you can hardly think about anything else than your sore leg. At latest, in such a case, the previously latent subject body becomes conscious to you as a physical body. And interestingly enough, there is the moment when I feel this is my body. This is my body. I'm bound to it. It makes my existence possible. But I depend on this physical body because in pain and in illness, I experience myself as a vulnerable and ultimately mortal being. It is such experience in which the subject body becomes a disturbable or vulnerable physical body that has motivated its medical research. And ultimately, this underlies all scientific objectification of the body. Here we have arrived at the other pole of corporeality, the physical body as the totality of organic structures and physiological processes. They can be objectified and analyzed by an anatomist or physiologist or physician. But there's another way in which the lived body can become an objective body, namely under the gaze of others. In this way, the lived body becomes a body for others, as Sartre puts it. It receives a kind of external facade because it is being seen, and it is also externalized because we consciously perform and present ourselves to others. We assume poses, and we use jewelry, cosmetics, or tattoo to make ourselves visible. The mirror in which one's own body appears as a visible body is the symbol of this external aspect. And this is why we have the term body image. That is to say, a subjectively imagined image and appearance of one's own body. And this plays a decisive role for self-experience and self-confidence in adolescence, because that's the moment when your own body changes in adolescence and its effect on others is being observed, especially in times of self-portrayal in the social media. Psychological disorders can develop from this, for instance, anorexia, where the body image suffers a massive distortion and one's own body becomes a kind of foreign object, even a rejected or hated object. Becoming aware of one's own physical appearance in the eyes of others is linked to central personal feelings such as shame, embarrassment, or pride. Shame, that is the feeling of being seen in an embarrassing situation, which makes you blush. And in burning shame, you become embarrassingly aware of your own body. You want to hide it. You want to sink into the ground because of your shame, as they say. In the Paradise narrative of Genesis, awareness and shame are very closely linked. When Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, that is reflection, their eyes open, as they say in Genesis, and they recognize each other in their nakedness. That is something shameful. Nakedness that they try to hide from God as if it were from the omnipresent gaze of the other. Shameful nakedness also means the transformation of the uninhibited being of a body of early childhood into the conscious and shameful feeling that I have a body. When you become aware of being seen by others and with shame, the reflexive or self-consciousness phase begins. The child sort of is thrown out of its primordial physical connection with the world and is thrown back onto its own body. I will come back to this later. Now let us summarize. The lived body as a medium links us with the world without us noticing it. The spontaneous lived corporeality is embedded in the natural and social environment and connects it to constant relations. The physical body always appears where this exchange, these relations and exchange processes are inhibited or disturbed, and where attention turns back to the body itself. In other words, where the subject body detaches itself from the environment. My body, that is my life, my subject body, as a conspicuous, self-willed, resistant entity. My life, my subject body as a clumsy instrument, or my subject body as an object of alien perception. One could also say the original subject body means no object, but rather the movement of my life itself. The physical body, on the other hand, is the subject body that has become conscious, has been reflected, has been stopped for a moment and fixed. So in this sense, being body is becoming, having a body is having become. As I said, we'd like to look at the development, the dynamism of development of this. And I'd like to go back to early childhood. First of all, an overview. At the beginning of life, there is pure corporeality, being a body. The infant is nothing other than what it senses, feels. Body and world are not yet separated clearly from one another. Step by step, little by little, in the feeling of one's own body, in the experience of resistance, failure, or pain, the body emerges and becomes experienced. It is only in the second year of a child's life that the child recognizes its mirror image. It learns to see itself from the perspective of others. So to say, it steps out of its own bodily center. It understands that it has a body to which it can point, that it can also use to represent something and place something vis-à-vis others. And this is what we call the eccentricity of human beings, as Plessner called it. What we call the self basically is nothing more than the primary bodily self seen from the point of view of others. And this is a position that a child gradually makes his own. But the pre-linguistic bodily and emotional communication with others began long before it began at birth. Let us therefore first take a look at the results of infant research. They will help us to better understand the original corporeality and then the further development into the interpersonal space. That being a body of the infant cannot be separated from the mother and other adults. The child, the baby, is not only dependent on their care and nourishment, but also on their closeness, warmth, and love. We can speak with the French phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty. We can talk about a primary intercorporeality, intercorporeité, as they say in French, a sphere of mutual bodily resonance. Or we can use another term, a primary intersubjectivity. And the first medium of that is skin, the touch, the contact. The skin is a boundary surface, and it establishes the separation from the world and the link with it. Touch is separation and link at the same time. As Novalis said, touching another person means you have a physical communication that says something like, this is me and this is you. Being touched by somebody means in an elementary way, that person means me. You feel yourself when you're touched by others. We know today that there are special receptors in the skin for this process. They respond to slow movements, not the sudden movement. For sudden movements, other receptors are there. These special receptors turn a physical movement into a gender touch. When the mother caresses the child, she helps the child to feel itself and also experience closeness and warmth. And the child needs this tactile stimulation for its vital growth as much as for his spiritual development. If there is no such warmth, no such skin contact in early childhood, the development of the brain will be affected negatively. There will be growth impairments and later on behavioral problems. The early bodily communication is not limited to movements. Babies, right after birth, are in a position to imitate the movements of others, opening the mouth, showing the tongue, frowning. That is to say, they, right from the start, have an intermodal bodily scheme, a bodily experience that oscillates between different senses, so that they can translate the movement of others into their own movements, translate and do the same movement. It's amazing because the child as such has never seen its own tongue, has never seen his own organs, but still the own body of the child and the body of the other are experienced right from the start as being related, and they have a kind of resonance with each other. And through these involuntary imitations, more and more an emotional resonance develops between mother and child. In the first 6 to 8 weeks in the mother-child relationship, you have proto-conversations, finely tuned coordinations of gestures, vocalizations, and of affects. They are similar to a real conversation. It's a conversation, a dialogue between the two. Daniel Stern called it the affect tuning, interaffectivity. That is to say, sharing feelings. Both partners, says Stern, know the steps and the music inside out, and they can therefore move in exact harmony with each other. It's like in a dance. So they can share their feelings in a non-verbal way. A mutual understanding develops on the basis of bodily resonance, a primary empathy. In the course of these interbodily interactions, the child also acquires specific emotional forms of dealing with other persons. And Daniel Stern describes that as an implicit relational knowledge. Implicit because it's not a conscious thing that you know and can utter. It's inside your body. It's a pre-reflexive knowledge or know-how. The child knows how to deal with others, how to exchange feeling, how to attract attention, how to re-establish contacts. Such patterns of interaction are developed from the earliest childhood. They become part of the implicit memory, the bodily memory. Not unlike the skill of walking upright, of handling things skillfully, which the child will eventually learn. Dealing with others must also be learned, with all its subtle rhythms and forms of movement and expression. In a sense, this is a kind of musical memory that emerges. That is why we use the term dance. You must be able to hear the undertones, the music that happens in the interaction with others, because this is crucial for the ability of empathy, the intuitive empathy with the moods and feelings of others. This is the primary physical interaction that is the basis of all other developments. And that is why I said it's so important to be physically present. We can write and talk to each other in a different way. On the next level, the secondary intersubjectivity, step by step, the linguistic and symbolical communication develops. And it's a decisive step when you see the phenomenon of shared joint attention. And that is so important that Michael Tomasello, one of the most important researchers of this development, talks about the 9-month revolution. Because it is about when the child is 8 to 9 months old when this new phenomenon emerges, as we can see in the picture. Babies, infants now begin to face objects together with adults. They understand the pointing gestures of adults. That is to say, they follow the direction of a pointed finger with their gaze. And soon, children start pointing at things themselves, as you can see here. And they make sure that the adult is paying attention to the same thing. They briefly glance at the adult to make sure they're paying attention. Pointing involves a common reference to a third thing that is seen and handled by both partners. And both persons are aware of this common directionality. It's very important to note it's not just about the pointing gesture, it's about the awareness, yes, the other sees it too. This is the situation that can be described mathematically as a triangulation, a triadic interaction. Before that, there was the dyad, primary interaction, the intercorporeality. Now this opens and the infant develops, together with the adult, a shared awareness of objects. The basis of this triangle is still the primary relationship between mother and child, or father and child, as it were. The sides of these triangle are the convergent directions of their glances at the object. These glances converge, and it's also symbolizing this triangle, the pointing gestures of mother and child. In Tomasello says there is a specific human communication here. This is the fundamental limit of the mental and social abilities and faculties of other primates. Other primates cannot develop joint attention by pointing at something. How significant this is for humans is perhaps well illustrated in an Egyptian relief 1345 before Christ. It shows the joint attention of parents and children in the pharaonic family. There you see again, there's this child, it points at something and it looks back at the mother, Nefertiti. And this child, when looking at Nefertiti, makes sure she looks at the same thing. Also, the other two children are involved. They also have these pointing gesture. The third child, it can hardly be seen on the shoulder, but all these children are pointing. Joint attention fundamentally transforms the attitude towards other and towards things. In order to show the object to an adult, the child must grasp what the adult sees. That is to say, it must at least implicitly understand the spatial perspective of the adult, a perspective that is different from the own perspective. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to point. In this way, the child develops a first understanding for the perspectives of others. And we will see that this also becomes important for the differentiation between subject body, or the body I am, and the body I have. But the things also change. When seen through the eyes of others, they really become objects, something that exists independent of my primary own perspective. It's a given thing. That is to say, these things are no longer just there for me, but also for others, for everyone. They are objects of a common reality.
And this is further supported by the interactive handling of objects. And but in an action context, the common reference to the object is being reinforced, is being experienced through the body. The ball that the child sees is the ball that she receives from its mother, and which it gives back to her mother, with which they play together. And the ball thus is embedded in the familiarity with the shared world. And we need to keep in mind that the child's perception is interactive from the very beginning on, and is something which is culturally shaped. Plate, spoon, chair, playroom, clothes, shoes, all these things, everything that the child becomes familiar with, are culturally shaped objects that you deal with together. Joint attention and the associated pointing gesture are also the prerequisite for the acquisition of language. The pointing movement is the basic form of all representational and symbolic expressions. Pointing points to the object. Pointing and sign, interpreting a sign and significance, all these things are etymologically strongly related, as we can already glean from the Latin dicere, which means to speak, and digitus, the finger, digital, comes from digitus. So the symbolic, the things that you have shown. And the first words are soon associated with this pointing gestures. The parents point at objects and name them. The children recognizes that the parents are using words with the designation intention. And the child begins to adopt these words. These words are being incorporated. The child takes its own pointing gestures and underpins them with sounds. The sounds themselves take on a pointing character, and after some time it will be enough to just pronounce the sound in order to point to an object. These learning processes are always embedded in cooperative activities, changing diapers, eating together, building a tower of blocks, and so on. These are typical contexts in which the corresponding words are being learned by the child. The ability to use language, thus, develops in intersubjective action in a shared practice. Words, of course, no longer designate only what is concretely shown, but always refer to something that is general. For the individual item as such, there are no terms, fundamentally speaking, and that's very important for us to keep in mind. Before the acquisition of language, the child saw only individual things with a certain expression or a suitability. It wouldn't have seen the chair as a prototype, but it saw something to sit on. It didn't see one block, but something to build with, and so on. Things always seem to be new and kind of different to the child under the impression of the specific situation. But the generality of the term fundamentally changes this kind of experience. And in the course of the linguistic, conceptual division and classification of the world, the child perceives things now in a different manner. The child sees and hears also the general, the typical, that is a chair, a stone, a cat. What a chair or a cat is something that we grasp as children in situations of joint attention and naming. And their concept subsequently has entered our perception as a type, standing for a larger number. Every perceived object now refers to the general perspective of the others. And gradually now, the linguistic version becomes the dominating reality, and it allows to categorize and sort things. Well, you have to pay a price for this. Namely, the price is that the expression and the essential quality of the individual increasingly move into the background. Only the lyrical language, the poetic language, is able to evoke this quality of the concrete object and the individual. With certain means, the language manages to conjure up the individuality which normally would move into the background. But in return, language opens up a new imaginative space of unlimited dimension. It makes it possible to designate even something that is not present, that is absent, something that has just been imagined, something that might be possible. All those things to which a finger could not longer point because it's simply not there. But the word can make even the most distant object, the most distant things, present in an almost magical manner. Joint attention, therefore, is now directed to absent things, general things, increasingly abstract objects. For instance, might be directed to what we could do tomorrow together, or to what is just or not just, to what all people have in common, and so on. So we share our perspectives and views via the language. We can compare them with one another, correct and change them if necessary. Human perception, and that's how I'd like to summarize it, is not a solitary relation of a subject to its world. It always already contains the possible presence and the possible perspectives of others. The objects do not exist only for me alone. The table that I see there, that I'm seeing there, is an object that others could see from other perspectives, from their perspective. And it would have the same meaning for all of us, and it would even be there if you all were would have disappeared magically. Even Robinson Crusoe also and always saw his desert island through the eyes of others for 10 years before Friday then appeared on the scene. Everything that we perceive is there for all of us, even if we see something just alone for us at some certain point in time. It contains an implicit intersubjectivity, and things only gain their objectivity through the possibility that they could be perceived by all people who would be in my place. In summary, joint attention means the ability to direct oneself to a common context together with others, to grasp the perspective of others as such, and to establish a common or to establish a we intentionality with them. That's an important term. We direct our focus together on an object, and we're being aware of it. That means we build a shared center of attention. And this is what we call the development of the eccentric position in which human personality finds its specific expression, the ability to step out of one's own center. The principle of triangulation and of the eccentric position underlies the development of self-consciousness, which I would like to discuss. Joint attention is not only related to object, but it also lets children understand how others refer to themselves. A mother who shows something to the child refers to the child. Children learn to see themselves through the eyes of others. And already Hegel, Mead, and Sartre have already argued that the capacity for self-reflection is predominantly mediated by intersubjective experience, that is, by adopting the perspective of others when looking at myself. Self-awareness arises in passing through the mirroring or reflection by the others. And the perspective of others thus is being internalized. The child's awareness of being seen by others is clearly recognizable when it recognizes the reflection in a mirror for the first time from the 16th or 18th months. This can be demonstrated by marking children's nose unnoticed with a red spot, and you then let them look at themselves in the mirror, while children until the early second year would just look at the spot, find it funny. From the 16th to 18th month on, they would grab their nose. They recognize and understand that what they see in the mirror is themselves, is a reflection of themselves. But in order to do so, the child must already have grasped the gaze of others as such. It must have understood that there is an external view on its body that was inaccessible to the child itself, but which it suddenly now discovers in the mirror. To recognize oneself in the mirror for the first time means to understand that this image is a view of oneself from the perspective of others. But this is nothing other than the view of one's own body as an objective body, namely as a body for others. The mirror also opens up a virtual or an as-if space. One sees something that is actually not really there where you see it. The child understands that the mirror image there represents itself, although the child itself is here, where it perceives its body. Here, it understands for the first time that pictures, are reflections, are images, things that show something virtual, something which is not there, which is absent. And the emergence of this reflective consciousness is closely linked to this ability to take an as-if standpoint, to the unmediated, direct experience, the eccentric position, that is the stepping out of your own center so that one sees oneself with the eyes and from the perspective of others. This eccentric position is only an as-if movement, as it were. You stay in your body while you do that. And it's interesting that around the same time, children learn to understand the pretend as if games. They use a banana as a telephone receiver, for instance, where they use a pencil for brushing their teeth. And later on, the third year of life, they also learn to play roles. That is, they play the mother for their own dolls, or they play a sales assistant, captain, or a policeman. And these role plays also presuppose an as-if consciousness. Let's get back to that mirror reflection we have seen, that in this process the child relates the image of his bodily being reflected by the others as an external aspect to itself. It sees itself through the eyes of others. But in the course of time, it internalizes this gaze from others so that the others don't have to be present at all anymore. And this internalized relation to oneself, from the view of the others, leads to the formation of self-consciousness. The child sees itself through the eyes of others, and with learning language, it also learns to speak to itself in its own voice, silently, in its own thoughts. We can identify the internalization of linguistic interactions with the reflexive, intrinsically dialogic thought processes. And in this sense, Plato already saw thoughts, and I'm quoting, as the inner conversation of the soul with itself, which proceeds without voice. Self-consciousness is thus primarily talking to oneself. And to be able to do that, you need to be able to speak in the first place. That is, one needs to understand and recognize the mental perspective of others and be able to relate it to your own mental perspective. And this link becomes clear when you take a look at the alternating direction of the perspectives that are reflected in personal pronouns, me and you, or I and you. They're also called pointing or deictic expressions, like here or there. The word deictic refers to their origin in the pointing gesture. By saying I point to myself with this word, and with the word you, I point to a person close to me. But it's something that not only I can do, everybody else can do the same. And this has been nicely explained by Merleau-Ponty. The I emerges when the child, and I'm quoting, understands that all you words directed to him is an I for the child. That is, the child must develop an awareness of the reciprocity of points of view in order to be able to use the word I. The pronoun I has a full meaning only when the child uses it not as an individual sign to designate the own person, like a proper name, but when the child understands that each person is an I to himself and a you to others. The use of deictic expressions such as I and you, or here and there, thus presupposes an understanding not only of the reversibility, but also of the generality of possible standpoints. Everybody can say I, as I'm doing right now. Well, admittedly, this does not create a known I as a new substance inside. The so-called I is nothing else but the primary bodily selfhood, the subjectivity in a body which has now become aware of itself from the point of view of the others. It is, as Martin Buber once put it, man becomes I over the you, becomes self over the you, and the self-relation always contains the relation to the others. Self-awareness thus means a dialectic link between a primary bodily subjectivity and an unfolded subjectivity, or between a body itself and a self, where the child learns to see itself from the perspective of others, and in doing so, the child discovers its own body at the same time, as if in a mirror image. Self-reflection thus also means a separation of lived body and objective body, of being body and having body, on this way towards triangulation and assumption of perspective. The body self, or body being, steps out of the original dyadic interbody in the triangulation and assumes the perspective and becomes the self, which now has a body. This is connected to all the phenomena which I mentioned at the very beginning, the body image from the perspective of others, not least the feeling of shame, which can only develop when I'm self-conscious. Let me summarize what has been said so far. We have now described the interpersonal space in two essential aspects, namely with regard to the common perception of reality and with regard to the self-consciousness. Having done this, it has become clear how the distinction between being a body and having a body comes about. Namely, it comes from the eccentric position that the child acquires in the course of its early development. Self-consciousness means a view of oneself through the eyes of others. Now, to recognize oneself in a mirror, to see oneself from the outside, all this means that I integrate the primary bodily perspective and the secondary external perspective. I bring all this together. Although self-consciousness thus reflects the self as being distinct from others and delimits it in this manner, it is not self-contained, but it is essentially relational. It is, in its essence, the internalization of experiences of social interaction. And whenever we reflect on ourselves, whenever we talk to ourselves, whenever we see ourselves from the outside, in all these cases, the other is implicitly present. And this then becomes recognizable in a term, the term of person, which expresses the eccentric position of the human being like no other term. It comes from the Latin persona, which originally meant the mask in ancient theater, then referred to the actor and the actor's role, and later then also referred to the person embodying the role. Persona was also called the role that one plays in society, that is, what one represents to the outside world, or what he appears to be for the outside world. Persona, therefore, originally has something to do with the sphere of the theater, with imagination and role play, which, as we have seen early on, would be learned by the child in the course of its third and fourth year of life. And the imagination of theater is based on a central ability of human beings. They can imagine something which is simply not there, which is not existing. They can pretend, they can play, they can transform themselves and take on social roles. Persons are not beings who are not simply what they are, but they are beings who can relate to themselves. And it's precisely the distance from primary bodily self-experience that enables people to pretend, enables them to playfully identify with roles and then to assume these roles in society, like gender roles, family roles, professional roles. Taking a perspective at the same time means that I take over also a role, and as an eccentrically organized being, people always play a role before others as well as in front of themselves, even if this role can over time turn into a habit, a second nature. It's the eccentric, the ambivalent relationship to oneself and one's corporeality that always brings people into a certain incongruence with themselves, into a discrepancy between being a body and having a body, to an incongruence between their personal and their social identity, their role identity. And that means that the own identity is not a gift given to people, but to search for one's identity can become a lifelong task, at times also become a lifelong burden. And it's self-consciousness that brings a contradiction into human existence, namely between the private bodily selfhood and the reflected being me, being myself. In reflection, we face ourselves. We see and evaluate ourselves from an outside perspective, from the perspective of others. And one's own identity now develops in the social world. It develops in the attitudes, role designs, and role expectations, which are taken over and gradually being internalized, just as self-consciousness already has been internalized. Thus, identity becomes a contradictory structure. It combines the experience of one's own primary self with the perception and recognition of the self by others. And these two poles of one's own identity never fully overlap. My identifications, my adopted attitudes, my roles, and my self-perceptions, my physical appearance, my image, all this is who I am. And yet, I'm not only these things. That means I do not have myself. I am only always on the way to myself. The contradictoriness of our self-being pushes us forward onto the path of time. The dialectic of the self becomes the dynamic of development in which we are on the search for ourselves as long as we live. And certainly, it's also the biological and social stages of the path of life that demand development from us. But ultimately, however, it's our eccentricity, the unresolvable tension at the core of our being, the discrepancy between lived body and objective body. That's what keeps a potentially lifelong development going. And to endure this tension and to reach a congruence, bit by bit, more and more, of primary and actualized self, that constitutes the mature personality. Thank you very much for listening.
I exactly stuck to my timeline. Now it's time for Q&A. For a Q&A, have you got any questions? If you have a question, please come to the stage for you to use the microphone. Dear Mr. Fuchs, thank you for this very rich, very comprehensive presentation. I'm Gunnar Tammert-Leftig. I study Waldorf pedagogic. I'm a master's student. I'm happy to be here. At the beginning, I had a question, but then many other questions followed and came to my mind. Let me ask this first question first. How do you explain the link between the physical movements like hunger, feelings of anger, of pain? You have described how they come, they are experienced, they're being felt. And how is that linked with our ability to control or suppress such feelings? there is this moment of consciousness that comes to play there. Thank you. It is an absolutely justified question. I explained the physical and the emotional side as something spontaneous, and this is what it is. We are oftentimes overwhelmed by feelings before we are absolutely clear about where does that feeling come from. And then next moment you are aware of what is the reason for this feeling, but the feeling is there first. Yes, and we can somehow handle those feelings, and the ability to do so, to handle, to control it, has something to do with the fact that human beings learn to use a control skill, the ability to inhibit the spontaneous impulses. That is to say, we have an ability to postpone it. We do not have to immediately respond to every impulse, every feeling. Our body creates these expressions anyway. Every feeling has a bodily resonance. You feel something going on inside your body. That is also a form of expression. And the feeling, of course, wants to get out, wants to get expressed. If you're angry, you clench your fists, and of course you'd like to attack something or somebody, whatever. But these initial impulses of expression can always be somehow controlled, postponed. That is to say, there's this moment of reflection. What do I do? Is it right to react like that? Should I rather refrain from doing it? This kind of form of retention means that your body indeed gets inhibited. You need a kind of muscular tension. You sort of have to pull yourself together, as we say in everyday language. That is to say, if you do not let your feelings explode, what do? You sort of feel that your body gets a bit tighter. It tightens up. The physical tendency to immediately release expression gets inhibited. That is to say, of course, you can always inhibit such forms of expression. This is people that have a sort of inhibition. They never allow themselves to show their feelings. For dementia patients, you can see that this control faculty no longer exists, and their emotions, they come out immediately. So this faculty of inhibition gives us the opportunity to adjust our feelings to the situation, to modulate our feelings. And as I said, adjust it to the situation in order to handle the situation in a more adequate way. I think that should be an answer in a nutshell. But of course, you can come up with more questions. I'm Vera Schindler. Thank you very much for this presentation. I am a theatre author. I'm still studying, and that is why I have a question about the pathic body. For me, the pathic body is an experiencing and suffering body. Like pathos in language always means experiencing and suffering language. Pathos in theatre is rather seen as something non-natural, something artificial. It's surprising because one could say that experiencing language is a kind of outposts compared to the experiencing body. But there is such a distance between the two. When I listened to you and you talked about the experiencing body, I wondered why we have this large distance. You mean the distance to pathos? Yes, you're right. The pathic is very close to the word pathos. But this is the ambivalence of the corporeality. Pathos can also be a bit too much. When we have this feeling that the expression does not really correlate with the feelings and the situation, if this expression is overwhelming, is exaggerated. Even when an actor, for instance, does that, you have this expression of theatrical, of artificial, exaggerated. In theater, of course, you do have feelings that need to capture the whole theater hall, and therefore the actors have to exaggerate a little bit their voice, their movements, so that everyone can experience. So the theatrical is part of the theater of acting, but you can overdo it, and this is what we call in German empty pathos. There, the pathic is no longer an expression of the feeling or the situation. It gets into the realm of exaggerated artificiality. And this is what I did not mean when I talked about the pathic body. The pathic body would be modulated over instrumentalized by a person in that situation you described. Their pathos is no longer natural. It is something artificial, but it depends on the degree of alienation between pathos and pathos. And of course, you have cultural links. There are certain people who are more inclined to be pathetic, to be theatrical, because it's part of the culture. In Japanese culture, people would reject that absolutely. That's completely inappropriate. So cultural backgrounds also play a role, but this polarity between the pathic and the pathos indeed does exist. I'm Ole Walter, I come from Oldenburg, and I do have a question. You have talked about the development in early childhood. In the beginning, there is the body, and later in life, you have this duality between the subject body and the physical body. What would happen if you do not completely go through this development so that this duality does not exist and a person develops and stays on the stage where the physical body is preeminent? Well, in such a pure form, it hardly ever exists because it would be a very significant psychic disorder. There are, of course, people who reflect more, are more reflected, and there are other people who are more children of nature, as Goethe called it, not so much affected by reflection. They're a bit more natural and live a natural way, but we all can reflect, can't we? To different degrees and styles, but the development of self-awareness is something that is inherent to people and is realized in the socialization stages. But it is something that human beings have as a gift and is usually realized unless you are severely disabled and have severe disorders. And that, of course, would be something for a developmental psychopathologist. As far as the intensities of reflection are concerned, there are certain styles, different styles and degrees of reflections, and there are individual differences, individual disorders where impulsivity, the inclination to not think much, reflect much, just live what you feel, let your affects take the better of you. This is what we have when we have a borderline disorder. There is a lack of reflected inhibition, a lack of ability to put yourself into the shoes of others, look at the situation, reflect about the situation. Affects are so overwhelming that you have no proper control and inhibition mechanism. But this does not mean that these people cannot reflect at all and have no ability to see themselves as being a body and having a body at the same time. So basically, the ability to develop a position vis-a-vis yourself, have a relationship to your own body, this is an ability that every human has. It's part of the normal human development. It's not something you can leave out randomly. I'm Sven Erich Feger. I'm very grateful for your presentation. There were so many key moments for me. It was so deeply moving for me. And my question is, at the end, you mentioned the discrepancy between this self-reflecting human being and the natural impulse, the natural body. My question is, I see in our society at the moment a lot of reflection on the one hand side, and on the other hand, there's this lack of reflection. There's this discrepancy more and more in terms of the exclusiveness of positions. There's no longer this balance also within persons, that a person would have this kind of balanced attitude vis-a-vis him or herself, vis-a-vis society around him. What can we do? Can we counteract this trend? Can we create a movement that is more balanced? If we keep our inner children, if we allow ourselves to be enthusiastic, always open-minded when it comes to something new, if we preserve our playfulness, because men can be men only if they play. This inner child, when we cherish and keep it, is this helpful? It's no longer so normal in our society for a grown-up to sit on a swing and just happily swing away. How about the playfulness? Thank you for this question. I like this question very much. I would agree that our society is highly reflected when it comes to reflecting other cultures, our earlier stages of culture too. We even have hyperreflexivity. It's usually a term that I use for psychopathology, but in our case, I think we can really use it as a diagnosis of our present-day reality in society. This has something to do that the view on ourselves, the glance at ourselves coming from the outside is exaggerated. In earlier centuries, this was not possible. We have all these photography, internet, smartphones, social media. In the old days, they did not exist, but you see yourself today constantly from an external perspective. It starts in early childhood when small children start playing with a smartphone, see themselves or others. Reflection starts earlier and earlier, and society increases this reflection to such a degree that a spontaneous behavior, I wouldn't even want to use the word natural behavior. This is something that is being frowned at. People don't do that anymore. It's no longer possible. And when we talk about natural behavior, naturality, people would say, oh, you're old, you're outdated. People would say, well, there's no such thing as nature and no man can behave in a natural way. I'm not going to highlight all these discussions around those controversial issues. Let me just say that when we talk about spontaneity and naturality, we have indeed great difficulties in our culture. And saying that we need a counterbalance, I think it's a very good thing for you to mention that. And indeed, it would always mean we have to remain open for, well, sort of letting yourself go, be spontaneous. And what you called the inner child, that would also include do something without thinking about it, without thinking about what is it good for? Why do I do that? Does it fit into my CV? Can I do something like that and mention it in my CV? All these functional things are there. They always serve a purpose, and everything functional is hyper-reflexive. If everything I do will have to have a purpose. If I always do something only because I want to achieve something else, I will never arrive at doing things because I want to do them. So my plea would be, think about your spontaneous needs. Leave room for that. Give your desires a presence so that you can counteract this self-optimization because it's really awfully hyper-reflexive. That would be my position.
Lila from Stuttgart, you talked about the shared perception of child and mother, the perception of an object, and you talked about an abstract object like injustice, for instance. Now my question is the following. How do you learn about these abstract terms like injustice? Is it a transfer of emotions from mother to child? Or do you point to something like you would point to an object and you then learn the emotion over time? You first express the name of the abstract structure and then render the feeling associated with it? Well, you picked something justifiably, which I just chose as an example for the options that we have to focus on abstract structures by means of language, and what justice or injustice is cannot be perceived without a certain level of abstraction. You need to give an example, and then you can say this or that behavior might be just or unjust, but the term of justice itself cannot be fully grasped with this example. So such a term has a level of abstraction that can only be rendered via language. That was my purpose behind using this example. Now you may justifiably ask, how do we get to such a term? I would say that all language terms or words go back to physical experiences. We can look at negation, either or, affiliation or exclusion. In all these examples, we can find experiences that you have made in specific situations. And even mathematics has its origin in counting items by means of using your fingers. If you don't have concrete objects by means of which you can experience these operations, you will never develop mathematics. So that would be the general answer. Now you can also study how do you develop an understanding of justice. But you're right. Without situations in which an adult would express what is being expected, what would be fair, what would be just. Without this input, you will never be able to develop these terms. But there is an innate a pre-form of an emotion for fairness, which you can also find in primates. You can find that in smaller monkeys. If they see that another monkey gets a reward for the same activity that it has performed from the lab researcher, then they get angry, they get annoyed, and they throw the fruit and attack the lab technician because they perceive something to be not fair, not just. So there seems to be an innate feeling of injustice in the sense that what they receive, I deserve too. So there seems to be some trait like this, but justice goes far beyond that, and that is something that you have to learn over time. And you need to have adults and parents to explain all that to you. In short, all terms would be experienced in physical situations. They're being experienced initially, and then put on a higher abstract level. These experiences also include innate concepts of something which is fair or unfair, which are then further developed through language until you end up with the abstract concept, the abstract term itself, like justice, for instance. I'm Emmanuel, and I'm from Berlin. I've got a pretty concrete question, and this question refers to politics. Being a child, it has been mentioned by somebody else who asked the question. Annalena Baerbock, the frontrunner of the Green Party, goes into a more childlike direction. She's more direct in her manner. She's got a direct expression. She doesn't appear to be like the typical policymaker, thinking long and hard before they give an answer. And she's being fiercely criticized for that. Do you think this is something to do with her being more like a child in a positive sense of the word? Is that something that society grapples with, find it hard to come to terms with? Thank you. That's an interesting question, but it's not easy to be answered because I don't want to assess policymakers, and particularly specific policymakers. If it's right with what you said, that Ms. Baerbock has got a lot of spontaneity in her speaking, I wouldn't think that she's too spontaneous. She's a highly reflected policymaker, knowing all the details of the business of policy making. But in terms of she appears, of the way she appears, she's got a more straightforward, leaned back appearance, more, as you said, childlike. And it could also be that some amongst the public at large perceive that as being spontaneous, thus positive. You want to have a certain level of spontaneity, of authenticity in you want to sense that. You don't want to have the feeling that a policymaker is only a robot, a machine, which just reads out prepared sentences. So a certain level of spontaneity and authenticity is something that we like policymakers to have, but then again, it shouldn't be too much of it. Otherwise, we would have the feeling they didn't prepare themselves too well. They might be immature. They don't show the necessary self-control and all that. So I guess somewhere between these two poles, she's moving, and depending on where the pendulum swings, it would be assessed as being positive or as being negative. So I wouldn't like to give an assessment of myself where I think Ms. Baerbock stands. But it's interesting what you said. This concept which I have presented in my speech means that even if Ms. Baerbock were a very spontaneous and authentic policymaker, in the very moment when she appears on TV, she's not herself anymore. She's not spontaneous anymore. It wouldn't work. As soon as I appear in front of others, I'm an actor. And myself, speaking to you, I'm not just myself. I wouldn't know how to behave spontaneously only. I try to be spontaneous. It's important because you want to be seen as a person, but because I know that you all see me and I'm standing in front of you talking to you, I cannot just behave naturally, in inverted commas. It's always a certain level of role play. And I think the same happens to Ms. Baerbock when she appears on TV. So there's a certain style, admittedly, which is being nurtured and maintained, and I afford a more spontaneous and naturally appearing style. But that does not mean that I'm just pure nature when I'm standing there in front of TV cameras. That needs to be understood. It's a style. Hello, my name is Bismaya. Thank you very much. You said that all words, all terms, and the way we communicate all stems from experiences. My question is the following. Are there concepts that need to be innate in us before experiences are made so that we can make shared experiences? Kant said that space and time are concepts that are prior to experiences and enable experiences. Or are you saying that because we are in the world as bodies, that all perceptions can be made and we then develop a concept of space and time? Well, that's a fundamental question of philosophy that you've been asking, and I can only answer by reflecting a certain position on that, which you are free to criticize, of course. But from a body phenomenological perspective, I would say that to achieve abstract on the basis of concrete experiences, you need to have them. We cannot develop numbers and the concept of numbers unless we start counting items. And counting items means that we go through these items. That is an experience. You look for things of the same nature and start counting them. That does not mean that it would not be imaginable. We just don't know about it. It would not be unimaginable that abstract structures and ideas are innate. It's nativism which represents this position. Space and time are not only experiences that we go through that would be engraved onto a clean slate, as it were, but space and time could indeed be innate experiences that we inherit. But through embodied experiences, they have to be turned into a reality. To give a last example for that, you could show quite nicely that young kittens, which are blind at the time of birth, experience space. When you carry them in a space, in a basket, over 6 weeks, and you expose them to the same environments like kittens who are able and allowed to move in that space. Then the kitten which were carried cannot experience space. They cannot move in space. They would stumble over any kind of hurdle. They are totally disoriented, while those kittens who were able to move themselves blind in space are able to develop a concept of space and then are able to move in space. And that can be transferred to humans. Without a factual experience of space, spatial perception cannot be turned into reality. How much of that would be innate is disputed and very difficult to verify, but what is sure is that space is not an innate feature like Kant believed it would be, because without a physical experience of space, without the experience of having the opportunity to touch items, to climb a step, without these experiences, you were not able to explore space. Space remains a blank sheet, remains a concept which does not exist for us. Just a conglomeration of blind spots. That is a very strong argument in favor of assuming that there is a gradual development over time. So we cannot exclude that there is a predisposition innate to us, but without a concrete physical experience, it wouldn't work. Thank you very much, Mr. Fuchs. I also would like at the same time, and said that, conclude the YouTube session. Mr. Fuchs, thank you very much for your intervention.